Thank you for coming to very last lecture series, last lecture sponsored by Center for Korean Studies. My name is No-Jin Kwak. I'm a director of the Center for Korean Studies. I'm excited to have Professor Katherine Moon as a speaker for this talk this afternoon. She's a professor of political science and Edith Sticks Wasserman Chair in Asian Studies at Wellesley College. Professor Moon is one of the most well-respected and eminent scholars in Korean studies, as everybody here knows. And he's the author of a book, Sex Among Allies, Military Prostitution in U.S.-Korea Relations, and many other publications on the U.S. military in Korea and Asia, and women and gender in international relations, and social movement in Asia. She has a forthcoming book entitled Protesting America, Korean Civil Society in Alliance Politics. Professor Moon's talk today is entitled The Politics of Nationalism and International Adoption in South Korea. She'll talk about Korea's changing policies and understanding on international adoption and the ways in which the issue of international adoption helps us understand nationalism and identity politics in South Korea. Please join me welcoming Professor Moon.
At any rate, I'm very happy to be here. I realized when I landed at the airport just at 2:30, and I was in the car coming over to the university, that I had been here last 14 years ago. And I hadn't come as an official visitor, but I came to visit my cousin, who was doing his PhD studies in electrical engineering, and his wife was newly pregnant, so I came to visit them. And so I called his wife, and I said, guess where I am? And we counted how many years based on her oldest daughter's age, so it was 14 years. And so it's a little incredible for me to be returning, because it didn't feel like it was that long ago when I was introduced to, is it Zingerman's? Or was the deli slash, I grew up in New Jersey close to New York, so I call it the Zabars of Ann Arbor. Zabars is a big, fun, gourmet kind of food place. And the only other thing I remember about Ann Arbor, besides a nice family visit, was just how flat, how completely flat the landscape was when I got into the car to be driven to their apartment. Because in the Boston area, everything is rolling. And it took me a while for my eyes to focus correctly. And I remember thinking, wow, it's like a different vista, literally. So it was a new physical, eye-opening experience for me, and I still remember it as a very interesting phenomenon that went on in my head and through my eyes. At any rate, I am currently re-editing for publication a book manuscript that deals with so-called anti-Americanism in South Korea in the context of the U.S. military alliance. And I deal with, in that book, I argue against nationalist explanations of anti-Americanism. So I became interested in issues of nationalism, partly through my book research, but also I've done work in Washington, D.C. on policy matters, and there tends to be a knee-jerk reaction on the part of American policymakers or think tank types to looking at anything and everything that goes on in Korea, especially when it comes to the U.S. and, of course, Japan to some extent, a knee-jerk reaction that's called a nationalistic response. So the FTA, the Free Trade Agreement, for example, the tendency is to look at Korean domestic society's responses as being irrationally emotional, in a nationalistic sense, and lacking a certain kind of rational, deliberative civic culture. To some extent, I would agree with that, and I would have to qualify that. But I find that kind of a monolithic generalization, very dissatisfying intellectually, and potentially harmful in terms of policy. And so I became more and more interested in this issue of Korean nationalism and the way that Korean nationalism is perceived within Korea and outside of Korea. I don't have to list to you all of the, quote, nationalistic issues that have come up in terms of Korean politics, anti-Americanism, of course, the candlelight vigils of the early 2000s, the demand for a revision of the status of forces agreement with the U.S. military, opposition to the free trade agreement, the mass protests against the re-importation of U.S. beef very recently, of course, anti-Japanism over Dokdo Takeshima. And some of you may not know, some of you may know of kimchi wars during the mid-1990s, which is really funny to read about. I mean, it was serious trade issues, but it's funny because it's all over, it's about kimchi. And whether Japanese kimchi versus Korean kimchi, what's the real thing, and does authenticity matter? So that was mid-90s. You have, of course, the border claims with China over Goguryeo starting in the early 2000s in a very public manner. And many of these issues continue today. And you see it all over the internet. You see it in the Korean news, newspapers, and many Americans get very filtered visions or filtered interpretations of these kinds of issues. So you might wonder, what does adoption or what do children have to do with understanding Korean nationalism? And let me try to explain. It's not a usual thing to do, especially for a political scientist. International adoption is not something that political scientists tend to study, and I tend to be a mutant political scientist, or an oddball in the sense that I take issues that anthropologists, sociologists, and others may study and try to put it into a political science framework. But I find this issue of international adoption in Korea and in other countries fascinating because they help shed light on the changing nature of nationalistic sensibilities or responses. And in the case of international adoption, I think it helps us to avoid simplistic, mantra-like understandings of Korean nationalism. And I hope my talk will prove that. And I find also that focusing adoption throws into high relief the complexities and contradictions of nationalism, nation, and the politics of belonging in South Korea and in a comparative context. And the politics of belonging, all of these changes around nationalism, nation, collective identity, it's taking place, the changes are taking place in a Korea that is so in flux every day and in the midst of transformation on so many levels when it comes to demographic factors. And I will explain that further in my talk. So the order of the talk goes something like this: to first give you the nationalist context of international adoption and domestic adoption, the criticisms against or criticisms of international adoption that have been made by foreigners outside of South Korea as well as within South Korea. Third, the Korean state's efforts to reduce international adoption and increase domestic adoption through incentives, and also the attending South Korean society's responses to those incentives or state policies for increasing domestic adoption. And then fourth, to try to give you a sense of comparative nationalisms around the issue of international adoption, because I don't want you to walk away from this lecture thinking only South Koreans get crazy and defensive about international adoption, because many countries do. And the last is to share with you the changing notions of nation, of the politics of belonging, and the implications for both international adoption and the way that we conceptualize adoption in South Korea, how the changing demographics are affecting adoption, and where orphans and abandoned children fit in to the changing context of South Korean society. And I will take you through that. I've learned a lot through Professor Ki-Yuk Shin's work. Those of you who are familiar with him, he's out at Stanford, and his book called Ethnic Nationalism in Korea does really an excellent job of explaining the construction of ethnic nationalism in both Koreas, but today we talk about South Korea. And I emphasize the construction of it, and that he argues that it's a reaction to or a response to Japanese colonialism and imperialism. It's not something that is necessarily essentialist, the way many South Koreans view ethnic nationalism as an essentialist part of their nature. So he did extensive studies, and he reports in his book from a 2000 survey that 93% of respondents in a very large survey, quote, responded, quote, "Our nation has a single bloodline." 95% agreed that, quote, "North Korean people are the same Korean ethnic nation," unquote. Additionally, 83% felt that Koreans living abroad, whether they had emigrated and attained citizenship elsewhere, or whether they were born outside of Korea and were considered legal citizens of a foreign country, still belonged to the same Han race because of shared ancestry. He also cites a 1999 survey that about 70% of the respondents claimed, and these were, again, large surveys, 70% claimed that, quote, blood was the most important criterion for defining the Korean nation. So this is what we're talking about in terms of what Koreans call 혈통주의, bloodline nationalism or ethno-nationalism in English. So I don't need, I give you those quotes to show you that I don't need to prove to you that ethno-nationalism is a strong factor in Korean identity and Korean society, and yet I seek to critique aspects of this. Whoops. Of course, when we think about international adoption in South Korea, we go back many decades to the Korean War. International adoption is a direct descendant or a legacy or a consequence of the Korean War. And so orphans are a legacy of that war. My PowerPoint capacity, skills are still very, let's say they're growing, they're developing. They're in the fledgling stage. This is only my third time, I think, I've ever done a public PowerPoint. So as my very younger students said to me, "Oh, Professor Moon, you didn't know how to size the pixels correctly, etc." But this picture, this photograph, many of us have seen in various history books or depictions of South Korean orphans, okay? And we are talking about war orphans. And so in Korea, there has developed a nationalistic sensitivity, rhetoric, and state-centered policy framing around international adoption from the very start of adoption practices. Originally, international adoption was intended to maintain a, quote, pure Korean bloodline, and only interracial orphaned children from the Korean War era and its aftermath were selected for overseas adoption, according to one scholar. But starting in 1958, children of full Korean heritage overtook those of half Korean heritage or lineage in inter-country adoption statistics, and the trend has continued to the present. So the majority, the overwhelming majority from 1958 on of those children sent abroad have been full-blooded Koreans. Okay? So this whole notion of orphans as legacies of war, they started it, but they were not the ones who obviously sustained the international adoption process. Even today, international adoption why is this not moving? Even today, international adoption continues to be an integral part of nationalist discourse in South Korea, partly because of Korea's growing wealth. Korea is the 12th, some people place it 11th, 12th, or 13th, depending on your indices. But Korea is the 12th largest economy in the world. It presents, the international adoption situation presents a practical and moral challenge as to why such a wealthy country and such a highly technologically developed country sends away so many children to be adopted, reared by foreigners. And if you look here, Ms. Lee gave me the pointer, but it's too much technology for me, so I'll just use my hands. So in 1954, South Korea starts with the Child Placement Services Agency, which officially is supposed to take care of these war orphans and send them abroad. From 1958, though, as I mentioned, from 1958 to 2008, you have predominantly full-blooded Koreans being sent away. So out of 230,635 orphans or abandoned children, 70% of them are adopted internationally. And two-thirds of those, two-thirds of the 70%, are adopted by Americans. Okay. You have a peak in 1985-86, reaching 9,000 children going abroad through the international adoption process. And keep the figures in mind, keep the time periods in mind. We can talk about this later. By 2007, you're down to around 1,265, but that's still very high. Because if you look at the rankings of top sending countries, Korea has consistently, even in recent years with its new wealth, remained the 3rd, 4th, or 5th ranking country in terms of sending children overseas for adoption. Supplanted by China, Russia, Guatemala. Guatemala right now is going through some transformations, trying to adopt the Hague Convention on Adoption. So it's in flux. They're going from private adoption only to a more public adoption process. But Korea is up there. And for many Koreans, this is an embarrassment. We're a wealthy country, they argue. Why do we send so many kids abroad? Is this a national embarrassment? Is this a national failure? When I was doing the research on this, I came across one newspaper article where a Korean academic had written an op-ed stating, quote, India has 800 million people and barely earns a per capita income of US $1,000 annually. And it sends 320 orphans overseas yearly. Korea has 50 million people and a per capita income of 20,000 US dollars, and yet in 1 year it sends 1,400 orphans overseas. The years before this, the numbers were a little higher. Every Korean government has invited international embarrassment because of its carefree dereliction of duty, ... And the dereliction of duty, you have to ask, what is the dereliction of duty? The duty to take care of the kids, etc. The Korean government has tried, but the society has to respond. And what I will show you is that the society has not been responding very favorably to the government's incentives. So there is a problem. In terms of being one of the wealthiest countries and yet being one of the highest sending countries, basically sending the kids away. Now, one thing I find very interesting, my slide got, okay, bear with me here because I told you that I am still learning how to do this properly. So what I want to talk to you about is, first, a state-centered approach toward adoption, international adoption, that is part of this nationalist agenda, but it's state-oriented, and then to critique that later on. When we look at the evolution of international adoption in South Korea, we have, of course, the war orphans. And then we have a period in the 1960s and 70s when South Korea embarks upon rapid industrialization and modernization. And the adoption figures actually correlate with the jumps in export orientation and other GDP and other growth factors, indicators of growth. So in 1969, 1,190 children were sent abroad for adoption. By 1974, right, in a 5-year period, that number jumps to 5,302, right? So as Korea is industrializing and modernizing fast, the numbers of orphans are also growing. The ones who are being sent, the orphans who are being sent abroad, that number is also growing very, very fast. By 1985, as I've shown you here, the number peaks to 9,000. And we have to ask why, during this period, is there such a high growth rate every year? Scholars who have looked into this in more depth, many argue that in a way, international adoption was a form of family planning. It's a way to deal with population control while you are industrializing and modernizing, which in many developing countries, family planning and population control are almost prerequisites to economic development. Others have argued that in addition to population control, sending the children away aided or was part and parcel of a privatization of social welfare during a time when the Korean government couldn't afford to take care of its own in terms of state funding and state-funded institutions. So population control, privatization of social welfare, these all assist the state's capacity to pursue its modernization and industrialization agenda. In very recent years, the Korean state has taken on a different kind of a statist, nationalistic discourse or rhetorical device. Because now, many of those from war orphans to the 1960s, 70s generations of kids who were sent away have come of age. They're grown-ups, and some of them are quite successful. They live in the US, in Canada, in Scandinavia, and other parts of Europe. And they have, in the recent years, developed their own organizations, groups, communal groups, identity groups, and they meet annually or periodically to talk about their issues, to do some bonding, networking, etc. And this is a photograph of a Korean adoptees gathering in Las Vegas in 2008. And unfortunately, the actual photograph I found online, the people are not as heavy looking as they look on the screen here. But they look very happy, they look accomplished, they're young, they look socially mobile, right? And what does the Korean government, this is during Kim Dae-jung's administration, do? In his speech at the third international gathering of Korean adoptees in 2004, so the adoptees regularly meet in Korea as well. So in 2004, this is during Kim Dae-jung's, during Nomuyeon's, all these names are getting me confused. I'll just say it's still my flu influence. During the Nomuyeon administration, Kim Gun-tae, the Minister of Health and Welfare, met and welcomed this group of Korean adoptees in 2004, and he says to them, "I wanted to say I love you, but I hesitated. I had to consider whether I had a right to say that or not. I will tell you with all my courage that I love you all here. I can say to you with confidence that you will have a place in our hearts. I will try my best to make you proud to be our daughters and sons." Now, how many of you, whether you're of Korean descent or whether you know of Korean culture, have ever heard of so many "I love you, love, love, love" in a public speech, let alone in a private context, right? I read this and I said, this is ridiculous, that a minister, right, of health and welfare is telling this gathering of Korean adoptees that he loves them. I mean, he doesn't even say that to his own children, I bet, right? And when you examine these efforts by the Korean government, there is a state-centered agenda in mind, because this group, the new generation, the of age now, adoptees, as well as many overseas Koreans, represent something very important to South Korean continued economic development, which is capital, both human capital, investment capital, technology, skills, etc. Right? And one can argue that it's part of Korea's globalization agenda to collaborate with fellow Korean kinsmen and kinswomen to build a stronger, more influential Korea in the global arena. And if you look at some of the statements by government officials, they have come out and said that international adoptees would assist in the national project of raising Korea's competitiveness and international standing and, quote, bridge Korea with the global community. The 1997-98 Overseas Koreans Act provide special 2-year visas for eligible Koreans, or Korean hyphenated Koreans, including Korean adoptees, to work in Korea, invest in Korea, buy real estate in Korea, obtain medical insurance in Korea, etc. These are benefits that other foreigners in Korea do not get. The law uses, quote, the legal categories to define Korean identity, but it also entails the construction of a Korean identity that is based on, quote, primordial ethnic ties and the belief in shared blood and heritage. 혈통주의. This is one quote that I take from another scholar. So what this has amounted to, even with the best intentions, I would say, on the part of the Korean state, is still a state-centered ethnic identity for adoptees and other diasporic Koreans, a state-imposed identity rather than one that individuals and groups generate on their own. Now, if we look at the history of international adoption in Korea, there's been a lot of criticism, okay, about its practices and the numbers of Koreans that were being sent abroad, especially in the 1980s. And in the previous slide, two previous slides ago, I showed you the 1985-86 figure of 9,000, the peak, and I asked you to keep that in mind. During 1988, or in the preparation time toward the Olympics in Korea, there was a lot of attention paid to all sorts of things going on in South Korea, one of which was this high rate of international adoption. And so foreign journalists started paying attention to these numbers, these figures, and started writing very negative depictions of what the South Koreans as a state and people are doing. One writer in the Progressive accused basically South Korea of using foreign adoptions for the purpose of making money, basically using babies as exports. Okay? And there were other newspaper articles that called South Korea a baby exporter, and North Korea happily joined in on this criticism, saying it is an awful, horrific thing that the South Korean lackeys of the United States are doing, right? Selling the babies, selling Koreans abroad. And then Tobias Hübinette, who is an adoptee himself and lives, I think he's in Scandinavia, he's written a lot on these issues, and he called the sending of Korean children abroad through adoption part of social cleansing. He accused the Korean state of generating or creating a system of social cleansing to cleanse the country of impure and disposable outcasts in the name of social engineering and eugenics. So these kinds of criticisms were being made from the mid-late 1980s on. Confronted with a reputation as the leading supplier of adoptive children, the Korean Republic voiced outrage and embarrassment in its own newspaper editorials and columns over the negative international press, and really pressured the South Korean government to do something about it. And so the South Korean government indeed did try to control the situation, and what the state decided to do was to try to reduce the number of children being sent abroad. Even in the 1970s, we have here, from the 70s, early 80s on, a temporary ban of adoption toward Northern Europe. Okay? And the government classifies all adoption information. It's very difficult to find first-hand documentation on Korean adoption from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s into the 80s, because they literally were systematically destroyed, and adoption agencies were told to destroy them and not keep them as well. In 76, you have a special adoption law and a 5-year plan for increasing domestic adoption and foster care, and the goal was set to phase out foreign adoption by 1981. So this is under Park Chung-hee. Okay? What's interesting to me is these 5-year plans, and here another, these percentage, it's like the industrialization, modernization process. The goals that the South Korean state had set, 5-year development plan, the 6-year development plan, et cetera. So these plans were also affecting the way that people framed international adoption and domestic adoption. In 1989, Chun Doo-hwan sets a new deadline to phase out international adoption, because it wasn't happening. Eliminating or reducing international adoption simply was not happening. So Chun Doo-hwan sets a new deadline for 1996, right? Probably knowing he's not going to be in power, and offers tax reductions to South Koreans who adopt domestically. Kim Young-sam inherits this dilemma, right? And he extends the deadline to 2015, knowing he's not going to be in office, right? And he aims for a 3 to 5% reduction of overseas adoption per year. So it gets a little more modest, not to eliminate because it's not happening over a nearly 20-year span, but to set this kind of a goal for at least public consumption in South Korea. And what the Korean government increasingly does is establish policies to promote domestic adoption. So that includes strengthening the foster care system and adopting a long-term foster care model a la the United States model. I'm not sure that was the best option that they could have taken, but they were trying to experiment with different ways to keep Korean children in Korea, even through foster care. And I will say that the Korean foster care system, based on the research I've done, has improved quite significantly. And there are different kinds of alternatives for different kinds of children, so that they're not all institutionalized in big places. That still tends to be the case, but experiments with small housing or family-style housing have also taken place as part of this effort to decrease foreign adoption. The government also offered 400,000 won a month to single mothers, okay, to keep their babies, not to give them up, which is also significant in Korean society that still looks down on single mothers and children of single mothers as not normal. The government also offered 100,000 won a month per child to adoptive parents. And that figure has gone up at different times. It's been played with. The government also put children who are 5 months and younger off limits for adoption. That means that infants, okay, infants, meaning normally it's under a year. I read this incorrectly. So off-limits period for infants, newborns, okay, of 5 months hands-off. Nobody can touch them and take newborns outside for at least a 5-month period. And that is going to be significant when I come to a different slide a little bit later. And also in 2006, very recently, singles were permitted domestically to adopt. I actually considered adopting a child from South Korea and asked some friends, how do you get around the marriage prohibition? Because single women, single foreigners cannot adopt Korean children. And so one of my friends calls me up when this law passed to allow single people, mostly women, to adopt in 2006. And she says to me, we could do it domestically. If you want to be our guinea pig test case for the international case that it's discrimination against international foreign, against foreign adoption, I have friends who are lawyers who will take you on and help you. And I said, no, thank you. I don't want to have such circumstances determining my life and potentially, the life of a new child. At any rate, these are also, this is a significant, it's a revolutionary move on the part of the Korean state to allow single people, primarily single women, to adopt. Also, another thing the Korean government did very recently, I think around the same time, is to expand the age gap between the adopted child, domestically adopted child, and the adoptive parent. So the parent-child age gap was raised to 60 years. So if you are 65-year-old Korean, you can adopt a 5-year-old Korean child. Okay? Previously, it had been a 50-year age gap. Now, I find this disturbing because I don't think it's necessarily a healthy thing to have a 60-year age gap between an adoptive parent and a child. Moreover, this does not apply to foreigners. Let me give you a sense of the restrictive nature of foreign adoption from South Korea. You must be married for at least 3 years and, of course, documented. You must have a maximum 45-year age gap, the only exception being that if one of the spouses is of Korean descent, that can be waived. So the age gap can be waived, and there's the ethno-nationalism, right? So I actually called up one of the major international adoption agencies, HOLT, and said, I've read online here that you waive this age gap prohibition or restriction for ethnic Koreans who are adopting Korean children. I said, I am an ethnic Korean, American, and so can I get my single status waived so that I can adopt a Korean child? And the HOLT agency lady said, I've been in this business 14 years. Absolutely not. And these are the Korean government's rules, not our rules. And that under no circumstances will they waive the marriage rule, although under certain circumstances they did waive the age gap rule. So very interesting in terms of the priorities that the state has set for what a stable family is. And I thought to myself, I speak Korean, I eat Korean, my family would just completely raise this child as a Korean/American. I would, I don't need to teach the child how to bow or how to do all sorts of things, how to wash the kimchi in water when they're infants so that it doesn't shock their tongue, because I've watched this and had it done to me. And they're telling me that I am not eligible because, simply because I'm single. But yet, single Koreans are now able to adopt. And in addition to the marriage restraint for foreigners and the age restraint for foreigners, you also have a weight restraint. When I Googled, this was several years ago, when I Googled Korean adoption, I got information, procedures and rules, laws, as well as weight loss programs. And I was fascinated. I said, what on earth is going on? And it's because the Korean state mandates that the potential adoptive parents be of a certain weight in proportion to what is considered normal for their height and bone structure, or I don't know, body mass, body fat mass, or whatever they call it. So there is a weight restriction, there's an age restriction, a marriage restriction, lots of restrictions because the Korean government did not want to get a bad name that they were simply exporting babies, selling babies, or even dumping babies into foreign markets, right? All these actually are restrictions are actually quite good in terms of what we call the best interests of the child. You want to make sure that children who are being adopted are going to families that are stable, that have the finances and other resources to take care of children. Now, where the weight loss comes in, I really don't know, because Korea is very unique in that regard. And so maybe Koreans or the government believes that if you're overweight, you have other less desirable traits as a parent. I have no idea, but at any rate, that is one of the realities. And here again, we raise the question of the best interest of the child. And I asked you to keep in mind this restriction about the keeping newborns inside Korea for at least a 5-month period. The reality in the adoption world, and I know this from not only reading, but also because many of my friends are in the midst of adoption, both domestically in America, as well as foreign adoption, Russia, for example. The most important piece of information is that newborns are the most desired adoptees. Once you pass the age of 1, and you go on to 2, and definitely after 2, as a child, your desirability to be adopted declines significantly. So to require that a newborn cannot be considered, so is in a holding pattern for at least a 5-month period, so that domestic people, Koreans can adopt domestically, that makes sense in terms of an incentive for domestic adoption. However, it may not necessarily be in the best interest of the child if you want to give that child the largest pool of possibilities of parents, foreign or domestic. And here I give you this a little bit of pop culture. Katherine, is it? She was on Grey's Anatomy and did some movies. She recently adopted a Korean child, and she is apparently has a disability of some type. And disabled kids are the least desirable kids in international adoption and in domestic adoption in Korea. And all of the regulations and incentives for domestic adoption that I showed you on the slide before do not apply to children with disabilities or biracial kids. It's only Korean kids of full Korean blood that are considered desirable to sort of nudge Korean nationals to adopt them. So Korean children with disabilities are not even in the market domestically for adoption, at least in terms of state policies. They do not apply. The incentives do not apply to disabled kids or biracial kids. And so by default, most of the disabled children going abroad from Korea, most of them actually come to the United States, and most of the disabled orphans and abandoned children who are available for adoption are sent abroad in general. So this is Katherine, who adopts I think she's slightly disabled, I don't know how, a Korean child with her husband. And her name is Nali. And apparently Katherine grew up with a Korean adopted Korean sister. So she comes from an adoptive family of her own, in her natal family. Here, now I don't follow Korean pop bands, but these are the Wonder Girls, apparently. And I found this, and I thought, oh my goodness, are these sisters who are all adopting, Korean orphans? I said, wow, the policy's become successful. No, I was wrong. I was just, doing wishful thinking. Wonder Girls, they posed for this picture with infants to promote adoption, to promote domestic adoption of orphans. Okay, and what's interesting is Koreans have taken. They use celebrities to promote all sorts of things, as you well know. And I was, in a way, a little bit shocked to see this picture that these are not this Wonder Girls, this group's children, their own children, but they're simply posing as an ad to promote domestic adoption. Okay. How do I get this back to? If we just get out of it. Okay. Okay. Let me just shut that off for now. In terms of Korean society's response, okay, to domestic adoption, it has not been very good. It's getting better, but it hasn't been adequate. Despite all of the government's efforts, Korea's domestic adoption has only averaged 40% of total adoptions in the past 12 years. And then, of course, 60% of adoptions are international, right? And despite the compulsory decrease in international adoption set by the 3 to 5% formula under Kim Young-sam, despite the compulsory decrease in international adoption, Korea has not responded with a proportionate increase in domestic adoption. And in fact, when you compare the total number of orphans in need of a permanent home to the number of orphans who are actually placed in homes, there's a greater number of children who are not adopted. They remain orphans. Okay, so domestic adoption has been increasing over time, but it does not fill the need in terms of adopting a great majority of the children who are available as orphans or abandoned kids. Furthermore, there's social cultural problems that help explain why domestic adoption is not working that well. And it has a lot to do with cultural stigma attached to adoption. And this is where I find a clear discrepancy between nationalist discourse and actual practice. The stigma is so strong, the stigma of adopting someone who is outside of your bloodline is so strong that many Korean couples will fake a pregnancy to their colleagues, friends, and family members months prior to domestically adopting a Korean child. Adoption agencies in Korea, domestic adoption agencies, go so far as to assist women in finding bodysuits to wear under their regular clothing, under their false maternity clothing, so that for several months they look pregnant when they are in public or even with extended family. One newspaper article I read found that this couple, Jo Jun-bae and Kim In-sun, they chose to adopt a Korean child, but they were so embarrassed to even let their own parents know that they made up a story and told Mr. Cho's dying father that their child, the adopted child, is a result of a love affair that he had with another woman, rather than to admit that the child was simply adopted. So people are adopting, but they go to great lengths to hide the adoption. Also, 98% of adoptive families in Korea, this is a 2006 report, 98% of adoptive families write into or register the adopted child as their own, as their bloodline child in the family registry, rather than as an adopted child. And if the prospects for locally adopting a healthy child are this bleak and this tendentious, right, it's complicated culturally and socially and psychologically, imagine it is much bleaker for handicapped children. Okay. Now, what I want to do is, so that you don't walk away thinking Koreans are the only ones who are having these nationalistic responses and doing crazy things to hide adoptions and avoiding a domestic adoption, I want to give you a little bit of comparative analysis. or comparative illustration. And this is the part of the paper this is a new project for me. I've never done anything on adoption before. I've done the U.S. military in all sorts of ways in Korea, but this is not my familiar territory. But the more I learn about it, the more fascinating it is. So I'm working on a paper that does a comparative nationalist response to international adoption. And I would say the Koreans look really, really good when you compare them to the Russians and the Georgians and the Romanians, okay? And maybe even the Chinese. In Georgia, right after the fall of the Berlin Wall, or the end of the Cold War, the former Soviet countries had major problems with abandoned kids, orphaned kids, because their economies just completely collapsed, as many of you know. And so many of them were being sent abroad. And this, too, created an uproar in their native land, sense of shame and embarrassment, as well as an anger and a resentment toward those who are, quote, taking the children away from their homeland. And Katherine, who has written some wonderful pieces on adoption, international adoption, observed that, quote, sending countries are often stigmatized as economically weak, morally compromised, and pawns in the game of imperialism. And if you keep in mind the hurt pride, the damaged pride of the former Soviet republics at the end of the Cold War, having to send their kids abroad and having many Americans adopt them, it hurt. You know, it's like adding salt to a wound. Their system failed, and now their children are being taken away. Now, Nuli Shevardnadze was the first lady. She was Mr. Shevardnadze's wife, first lady when he was president. And in June 1997, she got a lot of heat for the comment that she makes up here. I am categorically against foreign adoption. Our nation's gene pool is being depleted. No more children should leave Georgia. And actually, she pushed the Georgian government, under her husband's leadership, to establish a moratorium on foreign adoption. She also said this, which created more of a stir. All the Georgian people are suffering hardships. Let our children suffer too. Okay? I have never heard anything like that come out of Koreans or Korean press, Korean mouths. Mr. Putin, when he was president, and the Russian Duma, the legislature, also was very sensitive about this issue. And they came up with restrictive policies. They blamed foreigners, mostly Americans, as abusers and murderers of Russian adopted children. There were a few random cases in the mid-1990s of Russian kids being abused, and in one or two cases, I think, dying. It was by no stretch of the imagination an epidemic. This was not systematic. They happened to be individual cases, and unfortunately, in many cases, accidental, or in a couple of the cases, just rotten people who happened to adopt the babies. But the Russian press and the Russian leaders made this in their own land, in their own country, made this into a humongous issue. That look at these Americans, they're killing our kids, they're abusing our kids, etc. And so restrictive policies were put in place during these years, 97 to 2000. And the argument was that foreigners are abusing the kids, that international adoption abets trafficking of human beings and corruption. Russian corruption, I mean, you don't need to have international adoption to learn about corruption in Russia, but you know, they said it's exacerbating corruption, and also the decline of international and prestige and gene pool, and that's where Katherine Bitten's comment about the decline of international prestige, a sense of embarrassment, weakness applies, and I'll talk about the gene pool in a minute. So they came up with legislation to establish bilateral treaties for adoption. This is considered a very undesirable thing, and which has negative implications for the, quote, best interests of the child, because it complicates adoption processes. Rather than following the Hague Convention's norms and procedures, which then each signing nation, each nation who's ratified it accepts, That means that every country that wants to work with Russia in adoption has to come up with separate negotiations. The transaction costs are enormous. Okay? It's too complicated, and it's basically a deterrent for international adoption. The Russian Duma also called for the maintenance of Russian citizenship, so dual citizenship. Well, the U.S. does not recognize dual citizenship. Many countries don't recognize dual citizenship. This was another way to prohibit, if not preempt, international adoption. And then they came up with a decree for the accreditation process of foreign agencies. And this was at a time when the Russian leadership was cracking down on NGOs in general in Russia. And so any NGO that had dealings with foreign Western governments or foreign NGOs underwent a lot of scrutiny. So if you mistyped one thing on a form regarding adoption, this actually happened to one of my friends. One mistype, one error like that, a minor error, would be considered a violation of such and such regulation, and the form would go back into the bureaucracy. You have to do it again. It basically slowed down the Russian international adoption process so much that a lot of people, especially those in the United States, gave up. Okay. So Koreans are not the only ones who've been sensitive. Russia has a much more severe problem regarding orphans. There's reported around 700,000 orphans, maybe more. The state only acknowledges officially around 250,000 wards, official wards of the state. 15,000 adopted, more than half by foreigners. Which, you know, if you look at 700,000 orphans, this is a drop in the bucket in terms of the kids needing homes. And then another 440,000 who are homeless or in hospitals in addition to this figure. And the health ministry has insisted that they can only count a few hundred such people, even though there are other statistics running around. So there's a lot of, it was very hard doing research trying to get good factual information on the Russian adoption system. And I think part of it is all of the sociological, psychological, and nationalistic coloring that goes into these statistics. Russian citizens also have negative attitudes toward orphans in general in terms of domestically adopting them. It's not only the Koreans. The orphans are considered impure, defected. They come from a bad gene pool. And there's also no tradition, apparently, historically in Russia of adopting strangers. Now, interestingly enough, Korea has a bit of a tradition. I wouldn't call it a tradition, but some practices. China has quite a bit of a tradition of adopting outside of the family. And there's also, like in Korea, stigma for the family and child. And Russians have something that I find very interesting, unique, fascinating, which is a sense of competitive suffering. And I read articles where they talk about the virtue of powerlessness after the Cold War, because everybody was suffering in some way to find their way. And they look at those who suffer as underdogs who conform to the Russian legacy of suffering. So I think it's this, you know, it's the Dostoevsky syndrome, or, you know, the literature of the Russians, the suffering peasant, you know. But at any rate, suffering gets glorified so that orphans who suffer or abandoned children who suffer are not considered to be suffering any more than anybody else. And if you remember Nanuli Shevardnadze, her comment, we're all suffering, why shouldn't they suffer? To me, it's not an orientation I can easily understand. Now, they look at the orphans as defected Russians. On the other hand, Russian nationalism lives on when it comes to international adoption, so that in the 1990s, they came up with a word called the Geno Fund. And intellectuals, politicians, commentators talked about the Geno Fund as this, quote, nationalist idea that precious Russian genes are growing abroad. This notion that basically if future Russian geniuses go abroad, the nation is diminished. So it's like the future Tolstoys and the future Turgenevs and the future, great painters and musicians are all going abroad, and yet the society has a mentality that the orphans and the abandoned kids are defected. So it's this very contradictory notion of adoption. Finally here, I want to get to the changing context of Korea, and which really throws off the way that we look at international and domestic adoption. South Korea and South Koreans have willingly not been willing to adopt their own ethno-national kin, and yet they have been willing to invite foreigners to intermarry with South Korean men. South Korea, in recent years, the marriages are increasingly becoming what Koreans call international marriages. The number of, quote, foreign brides coming to live in South Korea with Korean men, mostly rural men or the urban poor or poor divorced men who can't find Korean women who are looking to socially move up. They don't want to stay in the farms. They don't want to be part of the urban poor, even if they come from the urban poor, the women. So they say, forget you to the Korean guys, and the Korean guys are left wifeless, and in some case childless if they've never been married. So in 2008, you have 130,000 foreign brides in South Korea, right? All facilitated by the national and local governments. You have a growth rate of international marriages from 2001 to 2005. These are like almost exponential growth rates, going from nearly zero in the 1990s, or maybe 1%, 2%, to 13.6% of the annual marriage rate in 2005 being international, and now it's about 12.5, 13%. It's estimated that by 2050, 9.2% of South Korea's population will be foreign-born. That's about 10% of a population on par with foreign-born or immigrant populations in Western Europe, like France or Germany. This is a significant demographic change that's going on in South Korea. We can no longer continue to look at South Korea, or rather, we South Koreans can no longer continue to look at themselves as simply 단일 민족, one bloodline people, ethno-nationalistic people, 혈통주의, the emphasis on bloodline, etc., because the blood, the lines, everything is getting all mixed up. What is happening is that under both 노무현 and the Lee Myung-bak governments, they responded to the new challenges of this growing foreign population. And there is actually a word to describe this group, these multicultural families. When I first read in the Korean press, 다문화 가족, I had to read it several times because I said, what on earth is 다문화 가족? And it literally translates from the Chinese to diverse culture families. And I kept saying to myself, diverse culture families, diverse culture families. This is not a Korean word. What on earth does this mean? And then I said, oh my God, this means multicultural family, taken right out of the American English. Okay? And so there's this new vocabulary word of 다문화 가족, multicultural family, as well as Korasian. So Koreans who are of Korean descent and other Asian descent, because the predominant women, the women who are predominantly, the women who are coming to Korea to marry Korean men are predominantly from China and Vietnam, Philippines, etc. Okay? Now, they also come with lots of problems, and it has to do with also having children. There are about 44,000, quote, half Korean or Korasian children in South Korea. And the big problem is they're not attending school. If you look at these statistics, it's alarming. 15.4% of children aged 7 to 12 not attending school. 39.7% junior high school age. 70% of high school age kids not going to school. And the high school dropout rate is 8 times higher than children from 일반 가정 or regular families, regular Korean families. These are alarming, potentially crisis-type figures, okay? So the government has been responding, and I think it's a great thing that the government's been actually working on this fast rather than waiting 10 years, 20 years for the problems to grow. And these are some of the policies and measures they've put into place to try to integrate and assist the 다문화 가족 or multicultural families by investing $70 billion from 2008 to 2012 to support all sorts of classrooms for children, parent-teacher education, language and cultural training, and others that you see here. Now there's another group, demographic group, that is new to South Korea, which is the North Korean defector community, or what now South Koreans more often refer to as 새터민, new settlers. Right? There are approximately 16,000, quote, defectors or 새터민, and the numbers, as you know, are growing and will continue to grow. They also require the government's attention and funds. They need help in education, technology, psychological adjustment, emotional nurturing, the children especially, dealing with social discrimination, poverty, right? And I have here a 2004 figure, 38% of the 새터민 have experienced unemployment versus 2 to 4% of the general population. And here, in terms of the lack of integration, you know, a lot of Koreans assume that because the Northerners and Southerners are of one ethnic bloodline, that they actually, everything will be hunky-dory and wonderful once reconciliation, reunification happens. And I fear, in many ways, for all of the cultural dissonance, linguistic dissonance, economic dissonance that will occur. For example, according to one recent survey, 45% of North Korean or Northern Korean adults, 새터민 adults, said they largely or completely are unable to understand South Korean speech. Right? If you think about it, South Korean speech, even when I go to South Korea, even when I go to Seoul, I have to listen sometimes, especially to the younger generation, really hard to understand what they're saying because their slang is different, and so much English is used, right? So, for example, when I was born in the U.S., but I grew up in Korea for a little while. When I was a child, you went to the 미장원 beauty parlor, and it's right out of the Chinese characters, right? Now it's hair studio, hair salon. And several years ago when I went to Korea and I was trying to find the 미장원, I asked people, where do I find, and they looked at me like I was some alien creature because I was using a word that nobody uses, right? 사진관, photo studio, right out of the Chinese, 사진관, right? Koreans use that for decades, maybe hundreds of years. No, now it's photo studio. Okay, so Northern Koreans actually maintain much more Korean authenticity in language than the Southern Koreans did, and so they're really screwed. They're in trouble when they come to South Korea and have to figure out all of these codes that's supposed to be part of the Korean language, right? So you've got all sorts of integration issues, and 1 in 5 understand without difficulty. That's, I thought, quite alarming. Right? Only 1 in 5 from North Korea understand Korean language without difficulty. The point here that I want to make is that this demographic group is also vying with the orphans and the abandoned children and the multicultural families for the government's and the public support and sense of collective responsibility. The South Korean government established and financially supports Hanawan, which is the acculturation, quote, detention center for defectors. Korean government also established in recent years the Hangyera Middle and High School for North Korean children who defected or who came with their families, and it's all free. They stay there to get acculturated to the demands of South Korean life, everything from computer usage to prepping for college examination, etc. I'm getting all sorts. I was thinking of 서태지, the Korean singing group of years ago. The 새터민, the new settlers, they also get funding for university education, and they also get job support and are put in the front of the line for low-income housing. They can bypass Southern Koreans for low-income housing. So they get a lot of benefits, right? So the point I bring up here is that the orphans, okay, are competing with these new groups for the state's attention, funds, resources, empathy, etc. And yet, the orphans and abandoned Koreans are of pure ethno-nationalistic South Korean descent or Southern Korean descent. And yet they are the ones most overlooked. One of the reasons is they're children, so they're not a viable political community. They can't speak for themselves. But another reason is that, in my opinion, they don't have social, economic, political capital. Northern Koreans, Settamin, the new settlers, have political capital because they're voting with their feet to leave North Korea. This is a plus for the South Korean state, right? The multicultural families, the foreign brides, even though Korea is still very touchy about foreigners, they fulfill a very important social need in Korea, which is to have people married. You are not considered a full social adult in Korea, South Korea, unless you are married, and hopefully with children. And so the women coming from abroad fulfill a need that the Korean people have. Also, by repopulating Korea with Korasians, they are increasing the population pool, which is depleting fast. Korea is at the top of the fastest aging societies in the world and with the lowest birth rates. Okay? If you look at orphans and abandoned children, what's the capital that they bring? They're simply a drain on the state. So these are extra problems that orphans and abandoned kids face in the context of Korea's changing notion of nation and belonging and collective identity. And I want to emphasize here that when I look at the case of orphans and abandoned kids, Koreans are ethno-nationalistic when it comes to the group, right, the nation. But when it comes to the family, they separate other Koreans of the ethno-nationalistic line from their family line. Family trumps. Okay, family blood trumps ethno-nationalism, national bloodline. And you see this also in South Koreans' treatment of those who come from North Korea. The Settamin are treated very poorly, for the most part, in South Korea. So rhetorically, South Koreans can talk about ethno-nationalism and the Northern brethren and kin, but in terms of actual treatment of Northerners, there's a lot of discrimination and alienation that the Northerners face because the Southerners do not fully accept them as part of the national family, as part of the national collective. So here I have this division. Will Korea stay a 단일 민족 society, one bloodline society, or go toward a 다문화 가족, or multicultural family society? And I think the trajectory is pretty clear that it's going toward this end for a variety of economic, social, and other reasons. So I have here just a crass categorization of who are the 단일 민족, and I include the abandoned and orphaned Koreans, South Koreans. But this is a very fluid slide here, the fluid division, because a lot of kids from North Korea are actually abandoned and orphaned. So do we put them in this category of part of the new Korean fabric, or do we also join them together with Southern Korean kids who are orphaned and abandoned? What I'm saying is that all these groups have multiple identities that they can wear or that we can give them. And it's a matter of choosing which to emphasize that determines policy and personal treatment, etc. So you have this division here and the question of trajectory. And I end here with photographic image of 단일민족. Now, this is what a Korean child looks like, supposed to look like when she or he goes through, this is she, 돌, her first year birthday party, right? Or Nicolas Cage, who married a Korean woman. I didn't even know this was Nicolas Cage until one of my students pointed it out. And he's in his 바지 저고리, his Korean man's costume. Which way is Korea going to go? What's really interesting about this photograph is when I went online to look for a Korean child, picture of a pure Korean child. I don't know what I put in as Google notes. This picture came up, and what's interesting is that one of the parents' names sounds Chinese, and one of them sounds Korean. So I asked myself, wait a minute, is she really of the 단일민족 or not? I was very confused, which is to say, all these divisions are quite constructed, artificial, right, and conflatable, or at least deflatable at times, because I don't quite know what her real line is. And then my last bit here is, will this be some new kind of Korasian in 2050 who pops up? So I leave you with thoughts for the future, and I took quite a bit of time, which I apologize for, but I'm happy to take some questions and comments.